Thank you, Melanie.
Okay, wait. Okay, minus, okay.
Are you good?
Can you all hear? Can everybody hear? Everybody? Okay.
Great.
Oh, I guess I could take my mask off.
Yeah. Thanks for wearing your masks, everyone. It feels a little weird for us to be unmasked. But yeah.
Okay.
So we have a lot of themes in common in our work, and I was really excited to read your book. Like me, you clearly were obsessed with, I know that the narrator was based on your grandmother.
Right.
So could you talk a little bit about the research around that?
Yeah. Thank you, Maud. So Maud wrote a nonfiction book, and I wrote a novel, but we both really did a lot of work on our ancestry and genealogy and digging into our family trees. And so my book, I'll just briefly say it's a novel. The novel is the story of two women who grew up in the same orphan asylum, as they were called. It's set in the 1920s. It's set in 1927. And they meet again as young women at a different kind of asylum, but they're no longer roommates. Mary, the narrator, is the secretary for the very charismatic and dynamic female doctor who runs the place, and Lillian is an inmate who she's confined there against her will, and it was a eugenics asylum. I just thought I'd throw that in there. And a lot of my story, it's based very much on the story of the main character is based on things I found out about my grandmother. If you don't know a lot about eugenics, you're not alone. Most people who were educated in our country don't know a lot about it, so we can get into that later. And then let's talk a little bit about Ancestor Trouble, which is I was so jealous of that title when I saw it. It's such a great title.
I can't take credit. It was actually my partner's idea. I was throwing around a bunch of, I had Ancestor Hunger as the title for a really long time. And my agent, probably correctly, said that's just kind of confusing. And so I had all these ponderous titles I was throwing around with ancestors and trouble in the title. And my husband said, you could call it Ancestor Trouble. And it was sort of a joke, actually, because we both loved this old Looney Tunes cartoon where, Daffy Duck and whatever, it's pronoun trouble. So anyway, so yeah, I was of course, I'm going to call it that. And luckily my publisher agreed to that because but I can't take credit for that part. So.
It's great. And so Maud's book is a memoir, but also because Maud is a very talented journalist, she interweaves, Maud knows words. She weaves her own personal narrative and story of her family in with actually, a lot of research about genetics and DNA and stuff that, a lot of us know, we kind of know more about certainly than we did 10, 20 years ago. And there's so many fascinating things, but one that really was my favorite, because I think a lot of people, and I see that a lot of young people here, a lot of people know about intergenerational trauma. Did I get that right? Yes.
Yeah.
The idea that, and I've always thought, and so my book is a lot about, so eugenics is a lot about whether your traits are inherited or whether they are caused by the environment. And so intergenerational trauma, I always thought had a lot to do with your mother might have had trauma, and then she has anxiety about a thing, and somehow not on purpose, but you see her reaction. And I thought it was very much environmental, but Maud's about to tell you about a study that blew my mind when I read about it in Ancestor Trouble, that proves that it's not just being exposed to the person who had the actual trauma. It's actually somehow in our DNA. Go ahead, Maud.
Yeah, I mean, it's so a lot of serious hard scientists really dispute the idea of intergenerational trauma. I think a lot of us intuitively understand that It just feels true to us that these things are passed down. And there have been some really interesting studies. So, there's of course like the Holocaust study that suggests that the children and grandchildren of people who went through the Holocaust are more prone to a variety of, mental health issues. And that study is really hotly debated because you can't have a control group and this and that. And also, there's the question of, so in that kind of study, for example, the grandmother actually has the egg that will become the mother inside of her, and some portion of that egg already contains an ingredient that will become the daughter or the son or the child. And so, there's a lot of sort of uncertainty around this. But when you look at studies around animals, researchers, as some of you may know, have shown that mice can, researchers expose these mice to this smell that's similar to the smell of cherry blossoms. And they shocked the mice each time. And the mice started, of course, to become terrified of this smell. And then the children of the mice also were terrified of the smell, and the grandchildren were terrified of the smell, and I believe that the great-grandchildren were also terrified of the smell.
And the next generations weren't in contact with the original trauma mouse.
Exactly, yeah. And in earthworms, they've shown that it's not a trauma study, but it's more about sort of behavior and traits. And they've shown that in earthworms, it can be passed down for at least like 8 generations, I believe. So, so it's a hotly disputed area in the sciences, but I think a lot of us just really know that it happens, and there is a lot of science showing with other creatures that it's possible. And I think because of human exceptionalism, we have this notion that like, oh no, we're
this
special.
doesn't apply to us.
Yeah.
But I thought it was interesting. And then, so my book is about, it's set, as I said, in the 1920s. And I came across this story that inspired my book. Researching, when I joined Ancestry.com about 10 or 12 years ago, I really wanted to know a few things, but one thing I really wanted to know was how, I knew my maternal grandmother was an orphan, but I didn't know how she became an orphan. I didn't know what happened to her parents. And I actually still don't know that. I've never found her birth certificate or the asylum or the orphan asylum where she was raised. But the first record I could find of her was in 1930. She was age 17. I found her in a census record. And she was working at a place called the Laurelton State Village for Feeble-Minded Women, is what it said on the top of the census form. So that was alarming to hear that kind of like insulting words used at it was a government institution. And I decided to look into that, and turned out that wasn't even the whole name. That's all they could fit on the census record. It was actually called the Laurelton State Village for Feeble-Minded Women of Childbearing Age. And it turned out that the of childbearing age part was actually the most offensive part, because it was actually founded as a eugenics asylum, and the whole mission, it wasn't let me just say that, and there's a foreword in the book that explains this. So the word feeble-minded was a clinical term in the early 20th century, as were the words idiot, imbecile, and moron. They described varying levels of intellectual disability. And so anyway, there was a big movement. I just got distracted. Briefly, if you don't know about eugenics, I bet Maud can probably explain it better. Basically, it was I think what people don't know now, it was a very popular, widespread, and most people felt a very promising science is what they called it. And that's why listening to you talk about these studies, I think scientists are very careful now because of the wrong avenues science has taken before, and certainly in the eugenics crusade they did. Basically, eugenics was this belief that society could be made better if better people whiter and more educated and wealthier, more affluent people had more children, and inferior people, and this was very much in newspapers, in headlines. It's a very, some of this is going to be really hard to hear, but it was actually, very open at the time. They weren't dog whistling then. But the idea was to have poor people and marginalized people who were considered inferior have less children, because there was a real, there was a sense, they were able to tie in criminality with feeble-mindedness. So there was an understanding that everyone who was a criminal was feeble-minded. If you had a normal, intelligent brain, you wouldn't commit crimes, and they didn't take into consideration at all environment. So anyway, I went down a rabbit hole, saw this, that my grandmother worked at this place, read a lot about it, was kind of at first very impressed by this female doctor who ran it, and then I found it very horrifying what really happened there. And so.
Yeah, I mean, do you want to talk about
Good night, folks.
Do you want to talk about what you discovered?
What?
Do you want to talk about what you discovered about it?
Well, so if you don't want to read 20 volumes on eugenics, there was this, PBS has this show called American Experience, and they did an episode called The Eugenics Crusade, and I watched it years ago, but you can stream it, and I just watched it recently. It really, really, explains it so much better than I could. But some of the feedback I had, especially in early drafts of this novel, where people were really offended by Mary, the main character, who actually is based loosely on my grandmother. And actually, a lot of what happens in this book is what little I know about my grandmother's life. And so people didn't like her because she was bigoted, and she also was, people thought, naive, and why didn't she say, why didn't she speak out for the marginalized people? And so there was just kind of a, is that what you asked me? I think.
Yeah, well, yeah. I think so. Before we were talking about, I was sort of alluding to what you discovered that the purpose of the asylum was. But also, before we came out here, we were talking about how, my book really explicitly deals with my ancestors. Mental illness is also a theme in my book, but harms that my ancestors inflicted on other people. So, my ancestors enslaved Black people. My ancestors committed genocide against indigenous people and displaced people. And so I really, got into that a lot in the book. And we were talking about how with nonfiction, that's accepted as something that an author might do, and judge as to whether they've done it well or what the point is and whatnot. But with fiction, there can sometimes be an expectation that a narrator is going to be likable, a narrator is not going to be racist, that,
other people can be, but it's hard to attach yourself to a protagonist who isn't, woke. And so I really wanted all my characters to be of their time and really show, not have her be a white savior or anything like that, but also to show her vulnerabilities. And also, I will say what I learned, and I'm sure you did too, so specifically the place where my grandmother worked, it wasn't a place where, it was called for feeble-minded women, but in those days, it was kind of for bad girls. And there were very few profound, what they would call idiots, which was the lowest scale. They were a lot of the highest of the three levels, idiot, imbecile, and moron, as moron. They were highly functioning. Basically, moron was a term that was coined by a eugenicist, and it really talks about what they called the moral defectives. And just to give you an idea of a doctor who worked at the hospital the institution where my grandmother worked, a doctor wrote a pamphlet, and she described the traits of feeble-minded girls. And the women there were all aged 13 to 45. You got to leave when you went through menopause. you weren't there for like a second. You couldn't leave once you got there. It was just to keep you. It was just a warehouse you to keep you from having children, and they put you to work. But the traits were included actively seeking sex. These were, indicators that you were a feeble-minded woman or girl. Drinking, boisterousness, belligerence. I was reading them to my husband. He was like, "So basically, you when I first met you." Everything like that. And it was like basically all of us in college. But in those days, and the other thing was that I learned. I always loved the 20s because I thought of it as like this dazzling kind of decadent era, and I thought it was the time when there was a loosening of sexual morals, and I kind of associated it with Zelda Fitzgerald and Lee Miller and these kind of, and it was that for rich people, but if you were rich and you were a woman and you were gay, or you had a lover and you weren't married, or you any number of things, you went to speakeasy, you drank, it was against the law to drink, then you were considered wonderful fun. You might recognize yourself in a Dorothy Parker story. But if you were a poor woman doing the exact same behaviors, you were considered a menace to society, and they would, you could be locked away. You didn't need a judge. Your husband, who was bored with you, could have you locked up. If you were 13 and your uncle might have accused your uncle of touching you inappropriately, and he's a prominent member of the community. There were so many reasons I found where girls and women were locked up. And then they worked. They cleared forests. They plowed fields. They did all the work of this huge asylum, and they were farmed out. And many asylums like this existed across the United States. And the girls were sent out to work as servants in homes, in mills in the area. Their salaries were paid to the asylum because the girls owed the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, this was in Pennsylvania, for keeping them against their will. So they had to pay back by working as indentured servants. So this was not 200 years ago. This was in the 20th century. So
yeah, and I mean, sadly, I think we can all see how we're kind of moving back in that direction now.
So there have been so many recent parallels in the news, and especially, I didn't know this whole Roe v. Wade thing was going to happen now, but this was very much a thing. This movement was about controlling women's rights to their own bodies, the right to have bodily autonomy. As my amazing editor, Mary Sue Rucci, gave me that phrase. She just sat down here. I feel this book is not, I don't care what you think about abortion. It's not relevant what I think. But this book was about, and I also learned a lot in this book. I didn't understand until I was researching it that until the middle of the 20th century, women, even physicians, like the doctor in my book, who had gone to medical school and ran a huge asylum, if she had married, her husband would have been her legal guardian, and she would have had the legal status of a child, even long after we had the vote. So when we're talking about women's reproductive rights now, to me, it's more about, are we fully human? Are we adults, or are we children? And in the early 20th century, the eugenics movement, the way marginalized people, poor people, and especially women, were seen as not fully adults. The society had to take care of them, and to me, that's where any attempt to go back there is really frightening, knowing what happened. So anyway, back to you.
Yeah, I agree, and as you know, my grandmother's sister died in an asylum. She was diagnosed with dementia precox, which was like a very common diagnosis for people who were on like the schizophrenia, bipolar spectrum. And she did, I think, have some really severe mental health problems, but she lived there, I believe, for 17 years and died there.
Did she die there?
She died there. Yeah. And I have another. She was in one asylum in Texas, and then my great-grandfather also through my Texan grandmother, or rather through my Texan mother, but through her father rather than her mom. He also died in a different Texan mental hospital.
What I thought was interesting about your book is you have But I think it's because you're from the South, and Southerners have great, are wonderful oral historians. They're just wonderful storytellers. So you had oral histories that I actually didn't have. I didn't know anything. My family didn't really talk about anything that happened to them, and But you had that, and then so when you went into ancestry research, and maybe anyone here who's into genealogy, you found discrepancies, right?
I did. So on my dad's side, it's more like the northeastern thing. The Mississippi side of my family is much more like, don't ever tell a story that makes everyone look bad. Whereas my mom's side, the Texan side, the over-the-top stories I heard over time. So, I learned that my mom's father was supposedly married 13 times, and his father, the one who died in the mental institution, he killed a man with a hay hook, supposedly. And I was like, come on, who does that really? Of course it would be in my family if someone did, but come on. And then my grandmother's father was supposedly a communist in, early 20th century Dallas. And so, those were a few of the things that had stayed with me that I was like, oh, I'll probably never know, but let me start researching. And so with my grandfather, I found he really did marry 10 times to 9 women at least. I might get to 13 eventually. And my great-grandfather did kill a man with a hay hook, but it was... I had pictured like a Texas bar and a bunch of bourbon and I don't even know, really angry man. But he was actually attacked in front of a feed store one morning by a former friend of his who had gotten out of prison. And I discovered that my great-grandfather had testified against this man who had been accused of attempting to rape his own stepdaughter. And, I also have a history of sexual abuse personally. And so that was just, I had treated him as like this kind of like, oh, this hothead, this swashbuckling, like notorious ancestor, crazy dude. And, I really had to sit with that and be like, wow, this person did something, good in the world, whatever the rest of his life was like. And then with my grandmother's father, he really was, at the very least, a card-carrying Dallas socialist in 1905. So, yeah, I think we have this in common.
Yeah,
it's sort of like, let's get in there and, find all this.
Yeah, I think you're very brave because you've told the truth about your family, and I think the more we can do that, I think in my family there are people who are still alive who are very uncomfortable with the truth, and so I decided to write a novel, but I found out a lot of truth. I found a lot of true things and very, of course, problematic things in my own ancestry, But basically, the book is, as I said, based on my grandmother. I last saw my grandmother when I was 8 years old, and she lived till I had children of my own. I was in my 30s, and she and my mother just, had a falling out, and my mother said, I will never speak to her again, and she never did. So, and my mother never liked her mother, so she became immediately a source of, obsession. I was obsessed with learning everything I could, and especially when I found out about this. She worked at a home for feeble-minded women of childbearing age. Mom, why did you? So she said, my mother said she never spoke about it. So at one point I remember saying to my sister, I want to waterboard Mom because she knows so much, but she won't. Because I would say, she insists she knows nothing. She lived with her for 18 years. She said she doesn't even remember what she called her mother, which, I don't know if she doesn't, but I do know my mother did have a very traumatic childhood. Her mother was raised by nuns in an orphanage and had a horrible, very traumatic childhood and adult life as well. So there's a lot of trauma that I do know about that's painful. And I feel like my mom, has the right to not tell me, I guess. It was it made me very angry. But yeah, I did. I did feel, two things I got from my mother that helped inform the main character of this book was, one time, years before I was even writing this, my mom is very funny. And I said to her, and I said, did your mother have a sense of humor? And she said, oh, she was very funny. And I thought, how could you not love a person? How could you not like a person who's funny? But then while I was writing this, I was pestering her. And my mother was like, it's so boring. I don't remember my child. But I said, what do you think really was wrong? Because her mother did try to commit suicide multiple times. She did have a very tragic early, her whole life. I said, what do you think was wrong? And my mother thought for a minute. And she said, you know what, Anne? Nobody ever loved her whole life. And the first time I said that was at the first book event I did, and I burst into tears in front of people. I can say it now without crying. And my mother was in the audience, but it's true. I know it was true from what I've learned about her life. No one loved her when she was born. No one loved her when she was a child. So it really I hope it helped create this character who is flawed, certainly by today's standards, and by the standards of her own time. But what really informed me was, she came from a place of extreme shame and vulnerability. And imagine being in this world and actually knowing that nobody loves you and never did. Like that, I believed my mother when she told me that. But I also I liked that my mother told me she had a sense of humor. So I did, I think I just tried to bring that in too, and bring some of the life of the 20s in. So the character based on my grandmother did go to speakeasies. She had some fun friends. And she was also faced with this dilemma of, she ran into her old friend from the school who was there because she had a baby that was mixed race. Lillian is white. Her baby was obviously fathered by a black man. In different states had different laws about interracial marriage at the time. So I believe in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, it wasn't against the law, but you didn't have to commit a crime. What you did didn't have to be illegal for you to be sent to one of these asylums. It was certainly against societal norms and actually sexual norms for what they would call a normal a woman with a normal brain. So she was called feeble-minded for having this mixed-race child. Child was taken away, and she was sent at 20, to work only for the next 4 decades until she stopped menstruating. So, I wanted to bring. I felt like the eugenics movement was so much about race, about anti-Semitism. It was about fear of the other. So I really, wanted to bring that into it.
Yeah, I was really struck by that. And I really, the way that you developed her sort of awakening to the extent that she does become, more awakened was really beautiful. And, one thing that I write about in the book is how I was essentially a eugenics project for my parents. They wanted to have smart children, so, when I was really little, I asked my mom, my mom was also very funny, larger than life person who eventually started a church in our living room and cast demons out of people. And my dad was not. I refer to him as a charisma vacuum, which is kind of mean, but also really true. He's, I wish him well. We are estranged, but he's really one of the least charismatic people I've ever met. And so even when I was a child, I was why, trying to figure this out, I'm 3 or 4 years old, and I'm why did you marry him? And I expected her answer to be about love, and instead she said, well, we wanted to have smart children, and so we thought we could have smart children together, which is, a lot to, as we older folks used to say, lay on somebody, right? We wanted you to be smart, but so.
I have to just throw in there. So again, eugenics was, although we don't know about it now, it really was at everyone knew about eugenics. It was actually, they wouldn't have thought of that themselves. It was from scholars to farmers. There were better baby contests. So the idea of breeding up or breeding
Yeah.
or compensating for something that might be lacking in your genetics. This is very much, so it actually makes sense knowing now what I know, just that they would do that, although I would have been as shocked as you were to be told that, because of course we have a fairy tale idea of why people marry.
Yeah, well, my dad was, my dad is extremely racist, like an overt white supremacist, and, and my skin color comes from him and his side of the family. And yeah, so he was very into the idea of eugenics. It's like, the sort of downfall of that ideology had never happened for him. But it's so true. I mean, in the early 20th century, Bertrand Russell was saying that, color-coded tickets should be distributed to people to figure out who could procreate with whom. And, probably most of you know about the Supreme Court decision in which Oliver Wendell Holmes said, that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. So that was,
Yes.
actually the law of this country.
It was the law of the land, and also famous eugenicists included Theodore Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Virginia Woolf, many industrialists, of course, and I could go on and on. The president at that time, the Immigration Act of 1924, it was called the Origins Act. It really was about keeping people who weren't the whitest white. It was keeping, they wanted only people from Northern and Western Europe to come to the United States. So much of it really was about, of course, about race, but about keeping what they called nativism, and somehow white people from Western and Northern Europe were the native people from America in that time, in that they're thinking, and the other people were cheapening, or were people, Slavic people, and especially after the First World War, people who were less white, Italian people, and they were going to be allowed, that they were, why were we allowing our white people marrying these less white people? It was just the thing is, it was very openly, Maud and I were talking about it before, when you read newspaper archives from that time, the overt racism in the headlines is shocking, and it was hard. My editor actually helped me a lot. One was write an author's note, because you can't just plunge people into this. You have to, otherwise it's almost like the author's note should be called like trigger warning, because some of the language is just so. I got so used to it. I'd read it so much, but it is shocking, the overt racism of that time. However. Now is it better that it's now kind of all dog whistles? I don't know. She knew what they were talking about then. I don't know.
That's a fine point.
And your father too. I was really interested in your father, his overt racism, and how was that something? When did you first write about that? Was that was that something?
I've written about it a lot over time, just sort of here and there in essays. But yeah, my father, so I think a lot of people, especially people from the Northeast, will sort of picture an overt racist as like an uneducated person. It's easy to sort of like other them, right? If they're just sort of like someone you can dismiss who's running around and saying the N-word. And that was not my father. He was a really well-educated man. He went to an Ivy League school on scholarship and studied aerospace engineering, and ultimately became a lawyer. But he, from my youngest years, was extremely overtly racist, to the point of covering over like children of color and black children in my storybooks, telling me, like spanking me for watching Sesame Street because black and white kids played together on it, and actually openly advocating for slavery. So, luckily my mother wasn't in agreement with this. but she also allowed it to go on. So
I like that you represented it's not, that it wasn't, it's not just that we think of the redneck and the person who isn't educated. So I think it's really important that you shared that, and I think there is a lot of that that people don't feel comfortable talking about it, and that you did was very brave. And
I think it's really important. I mean, one sort of the didactic mission of my book, the main one is just like, let's be honest, about these histories, because how can we move forward if we're too ashamed of these histories to talk about them? Like, of course they're shameful. Of course I'm sad and sometimes still even angry that my ancestors did what they did, but I don't know, I just feel like, especially in this time when states are passing laws where we're not allowed to talk about the history of slavery or the history of genocide, or potentially at some point the history of eugenics, coming forward with our personal stories has a lot of power.
And I do think too, I think it's not enough to, yes, we want to amplify voices of marginalized communities and people of color, but we also, as white people, need to be honest and stop whitewashing, especially in fiction, our characters. And I really did early on with an agent's assistant and editorial assistant. They were horrified. A poor young woman told me she was unmoored and really wasn't comfortable at all with this person who was very much just a person of the 1920s, who's really was based on a relative of mine. But I think it's time now that I think it's time. White people do need to be more honest. I didn't feel comfortable whitewashing her or making her a savior or making her anybody but who she was. She was a poor woman and again, it was a very vulnerable time for women. If you were vagrancy was against the law, so if you didn't work, you would end up in an asylum. I really did. Lillian and Mary, the two women, one who worked there and the one who was the inmate, it was very much there but for the grace of God. One misstep and you would be there. And so it was a dangerous, very fraught place for certainly, the eugenics era. And it was a short era because many people might know that Hitler was informed by American eugenicists. He wrote about it in Mein Kampf he named certain Davenport and some others, Americans who he admired. The place where my grandmother worked, actually, there's people still alive. It ended up being, so anyway, what happened was, as you might guess, eugenics was very popular, not just here, but in Europe. People from other countries actually came to the asylum where my grandmother worked, it was a model place because they were building their own. And then the Holocaust showed what the final solution of eugenics is. So, women and men were being sterilized against their will in America, and that's how it started in Germany. And the first population in Germany, which I didn't know that was sterilized, were the feeble-minded. And then once you start sterilizing people that you just don't decide they shouldn't have children, and this goes back to bodily autonomy and who's human and who's not. But once you start doing that, then then it's not that big a step to why do we even need them? And that's of course what Hitler did. And I think that is why it was this huge, widespread, widely embraced, popular movement that came to a screeching halt right at the end of World War II, because everyone saw this is what could happen. And my grandmother never, that I know of, spoke about the place she worked, according to my mother. She said she worked for the government. She did. She worked for the government in a government asylum that was a eugenics asylum. But anyway, I think that, I don't even know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're making such a great point about individual participation in larger cultural phenomena, right?
Right.
Systemic racism, systemic, intolerance of, hatred of, sterilization of people with mental illness, Yeah, and I mean, I've noticed that a lot of us can feel really comfortable judging that on a cultural level and be really comfortable, sort of standing up against it and railing against it as we should. But then it becomes a lot less comfortable when we have to look at our own families, at these patterns in our own backgrounds. But to me, that's really where the individual sort of healing and sort of clarity comes from, so that you can show up better in the world. But also, like, collectively, imagine if all of us stopped sort of feeling like we had to hold on to these secrets and these terrible things. What if we just...
And you had heard a relationship with your aunt, right? She felt.
Let's not talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Is that the
one
one thing you said not to talk
about? Yeah.
Not an aunt, a friend.
Don't worry about that one. But so it's tricky. I wrote about my whole family in this, including my parents. And as I say in the book, I feel a little bad sort of writing so much about my living parents, but I also, they knew I wanted to be a writer from the time I was really young.
They wanted to create a smart person, and they did, and this is what they got.
Yeah, you chose to behave as you did, and so here we are.
I wanted Maud to read something from Ancestor Trouble, because my thing was, my grandmother, I never knew. I had a fantasy about her. I never knew her. There's one photograph that exists with me in it with her. I felt very, and I really don't believe in the supernatural. I don't know. I don't not believe. I just don't know. But I felt, especially this week, I've been traveling through Pennsylvania, revisiting. I spent a lot of time researching this book in Pennsylvania, and so I went back, and it was really emotional for me. And I do feel this connection, which I've always felt all my life. Again, just through this alignment I felt, my mother's attitude toward her. And so then I just wanted to know if Maud could read just a short paragraph that I think works for. It's kind of why our books, why you might want to have both of our books.
I can do that. So my book, it goes down a lot of alleyways, and toward the end, I take a look at sort of ancestral practices or spiritual practices around ancestors. And so Anne had asked me if I could read this. This is an idea. Partly I'm talking about something that Malidoma Patrice Somé said about sort of indigenous relations in an indigenous society, and the idea of a connection between the living and the dead. And when someone dies, mourning and ritual are imperative and collective. The spirit of the deceased attains wellness through the grief that carries them, quote, from one realm to another. They will continue to serve the community as an ancestor, so the community, quote, does all it can to ensure that their spirit makes it safely to their new home, end quote. From this perspective, all our dead who have not been properly grieved and elevated are unwell ghosts cluttering up the spirit realm, preventing us from accessing the wisdom of our ancestors and the best way forward for ourselves. Whether or not we believe in the existence of spirits, on a metaphorical level, we can see the consequences of our individualism and disconnectedness all around us. Giving deep consideration to our family dead is a way of reconnecting with the larger circle of humanity, even if we don't believe that the dead can hear us, even if we consider this kind of connection to be purely psychological. For myself, the distinction between imagination and spirituality has come to seem less like a bright line than a continuum.
And I thank you, Maud, because I said, you have to read it because I'll burst into tears if I read that. But I feel it really, for me, it really, I don't know if any of you, it seems like a young crowd here, but if any of you have delved into researching your own genealogy or ancestry, or kind of question your past, and also just what happens. Many of us, I assume, have had loved ones who have died, and I feel like I had a person who was not very much, who apparently nobody loved, who died. So anyway, it was very moving when I read that. And with that, is it time to open for questions? I don't know.
So
Yes.
if you have a question, Destiny will come over. Just raise your hand up and high, and when you get the microphone, make sure you talk directly into it.
And I can always just keep asking you questions.
Okay.
If no one has any.
Oh, I see some questions.
Hello. That was great. So interesting. I don't know, it's not really a question, but it's just to thank you for talking about the pressure now in the publishing world and for writers to make a character moral, particularly protagonist of a novel, to sort of, first of all, the idea that the author is the character.
Can you hear Maud?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Kathy, Laura, yeah.
Okay.
Hi, Kathy.
So, hi. So first of all, I was thanking you just for the idea that that there's so much pressure now to make a character moral, a character of a novel, and the idea that the author is the character, and the sort of fear in the publishing industry of a character that's not morally pure. And I don't know. I'm struggling with that with the novel, and I've been for a while. Where an editor wanted to buy it and the sales department said no, things like that. So that's really interesting. And I guess maybe that's all I wanted to say. The whole thing is fascinating. I can't wait to read both books, but I'm glad you pointed that out. I'm glad you stuck to your guns, of making her a character of her time who maybe was not morally pure but was realistic. That's all.
Thank you. Kathy Hanover, everybody. Famous author herself.
Hello. I'm also currently diving into my ancestry, and I think a lot of us during the pandemic may have experienced that same feeling. I'm just curious what point that obsession started for both of you. Ancestor hunger, was that because you had this real fascination to dig into your family? And especially it's interesting because for me, I had a lot of love in my past, which is why I want to dig in, because I love them. And it's interesting that on the opposite end, it seems like there's a lot of questions you both felt in terms of digging into a side that may not have been as favorable, obviously. Is this something that's been sitting with you since you were kids, that you wanted to know more about your family? Is it something that you came to as an awakening recently? And what drove you to dig in?
Well, in my case, these stories about my mom's family were the exciting ones, like that her father was married 13 times. So that's kind of what drew me into actually researching. But the very first time that I typed a couple of ancestors' names into, it was so long ago, it was like a precursor of Google. This tree came up, basically showing that I'm descended from someone who was accused of being a witch in Puritan-era Massachusetts. And so that was really interesting to me because of my mom's religious fanaticism. So, on my mom's side, it was more kind of juicy and troubled, but also I experienced it as kind of fun. This sort of larger-than-life Texan-ness of it all. And then on my father's side, it was very fraught and very, unpleasant in a lot of ways to look at that stuff, find that my ancestors did enslave people, find wills in which they bequeathed Black people to their children along with household items. It was really, really terrible. But also, my whole life, because my father was such an overt white supremacist, I think I just didn't have the ability that some people have to be in denial. Mm-hmm. I knew that this was part of my family history, And I was, the older I got, the more recent it seemed to me. So it's kind of, a big mess of things that drew me into it. And, I'm kind of obsessive in general, so it's just like a series of obsessions that I kept diving back into. And how about you, Anne?
Same, and I think maybe you experienced that too. But I still go on Ancestry pretty much every day. There's nothing. I mean, I can't. I'm obsessed, and there's still so many questions I don't have answers to that I will find the answers to before I die. So help me God. But I really want. I find it fascinating, and not. That any of my ancestors did grand things or anything, but they did really like we all do. Some of them were criminals, but I will just find out facts about our own history that I didn't know. This was just one. So I just love it. I'm neck deep in genealogy forums. I think you might be too, and online and subreddits. I also have like people who, because I keep my Ancestry subscription going because it's like a business expense, and I will always just email me. I'll look up your ancestor because I love to do it, and then I'll be obsessed with your ancestor.
I know. I always say that too, and nobody ever takes me up on it. But then a couple days ago, someone did.
They did?
They did. It's so exciting. I'm finding out all this stuff about their family, and and
genealogy people are super helpful. So in these subreddits, people will say, I let my subscription expire. Can you find this? And it's like a race. We're all like, oh yeah, you want to be the first one to find it. And the people love to do that. Love to help others with genealogy.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey. So this is for Maud. Your father, you said your father was a white supremacist, or he essentially is a white supremacist. I guess my question is kind of like two-part. First, was there a reason? I mean, I'm not saying that you seem to ended up fine, right? So was there, you never know, right? Yeah, okay. Yeah, was there something that in your family, that like made you feel like you didn't want to be like your dad? And on top of that, was it just your dad, or was it like his grandfather or his father? Was it something, because it seems like obviously you're like, all right, I don't want to be a white supremacist. I don't know.
It was his whole family.
It was his whole family.
I mean,
okay.
I would say that his parents, were less so, but yeah, I mean, it was the Mississippi Delta, and when I started researching, I hoped to find, that he had exaggerated our ancestors' involvement in slavery, and instead I found, this fourth great-grandfather enslaved 10 people, and this, fifth great-grandmother enslaved 2 people, and on and on and on and on and on. So he was coming from this, this environment where that was, I am not excusing it, but that was the reality, and that was his ideology, and he learned it directly, especially from his father's parents. To answer the other part of your question, though, luckily my mom was not in agreement with it, and I think because I found my father so unrelatable and mean, he was very, a very mean parent to his children as well. It was kind of easy for me, since my mom wasn't in agreement with him, to sort of separate myself from that. And I was growing up in Miami, which is definitely a racist city in a lot of ways, but it's not racist like that. So, there were a lot of factors that led me away from that. But one thing that I realized while I was writing the book is that I had set up my family in my mind so that there was the racist side, and then there was the not racist side, right? Yeah. And I was identifying myself with that side. But then I was like, okay, well, maybe it's not racist. Maybe it's not fundamentally racist. And then I found ancestors on my mom's mother's side who had enslaved people as well. And that was such a gut punch. But it was really important because I was like, oh, this is the resistance that other people have to seeing this in their families. And I see it now, and I feel it now. And I also know it's really almost more important for me to be transparent about that.
So about your initial almost resistance or denial about, like, that you had an idea that at least your mother's side.
Yeah, they were poor. They wouldn't have done that because they, hopefully they wouldn't have wanted to, but they didn't have the ability. All kinds of stories that I had in my mind about that side of my family that, a lot of people on that side of my family did not enslave Black people. But, this ancestor of mine, this accused witch in Northampton, her family, that's on my mother's side, her family made an example. Long story short, she was accused of being a witch. She beat the charges twice. And then when rumors...
Ancestor trouble, people.
When rumors started up again, her family pinned it on a Black woman. And in the book, I say she was enslaved, but I've since discovered it's not clear whether she was enslaved. But they pinned it on a Black woman, and they sentenced her to public lashes. So, and I also discovered that that same ancestor may herself have enslaved someone, the accused witch. So this is the history of our country. It's the history of my family, and it's really important for me on a personal level to acknowledge that and think about that and feel about it. But on a cultural level, it's something that, that we all, especially white people, really need to be taking a look at.
And be open, hopefully as open-minded and honest, looking at yourself and your family with honesty and without making excuses, making it just being this happened.
I think acknowledgement is not the whole thing, right? We've got a lot of work to do as a country, but acknowledgement is also not nothing. And I feel like it's where a lot of us need to start. So.
All right, let's give them a big hand.